I mentioned in our last video that there are people called text critics who try to establish the best text of the Old Testament for translation and study. And you will notice in most study Bibles that there will be notes that will refer you to the bottom of a page where there is some kind of difference in the text or some note that needs to be made about it. So, what are these variants? I should say that by and large, they don't really make a huge difference, especially not in terms of the basic theology. But they are there nevertheless and can lead to some slightly different readings. Sometimes what has happened in the copying of the texts over time is that a particular scribe might want to expand or explain something in the text that isn't clear. So we have one example here. The Masoretic text, the Hebrew says to spy out all the land, whereas the Septuagint, the Greek, just says to spy out the land. In Joshua 1:1 and 1:15, the Hebrew text is a little bit longer. It says, Moses, the servant of Yahweh. It explains more of who Moses is. Sometimes a scribe over time might mistakenly repeat something. They forgot that they'd already written it, they got distracted, and this is called dittography. So here we have in the Isaiah scroll where the medieval text says, return to him against whom the Israelites have profoundly transgressed. In the Isaiah scroll from Qumran, it says, return to him against whom, to him against whom. So the scribe, somebody along the way, simply made a mistake and repeated a phrase. Sometimes explanatory notes will be inserted, like a parenthesis. She let them down with a rope through the window, for her house was in the city wall, and it was in the wall that she lived. Whereas the Greek has the simpler, she let them down through the window. In Exodus 21, the Samaritan text says, if a bull or any animal kills a man or woman, etc. Whereas the Masoretic text does not specify that it is any animal. Sometimes the scribe, in copying a particular manuscript, might conflate two phrases that are in the original and just turn them into one phrase. So where the Masoretic text has I crushed them, I mashed them, one of the Septuagint manuscripts has I crushed them, and an example from the Qumran scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, uses I mashed them. So they're shortening the phrase. In Psalm 72, the Masoretic text has they will find their blessing in him, whereas the Septuagint has they will find their blessing in him, all the families of the land. And what the Septuagint has done here is they've combined phrases from Genesis 12:3 and 28:14 in their copying of the Psalm text. So they're kind of remembering that this has occurred elsewhere in the Bible. Sometimes a scribe will skip part of a text in copying. So in Judges, Masoretic text, he said to her, if you weave the 7 braids of my hair with a web, and she fastened it with a pin. Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And it seems that the Septuagint is a better reading here in that it explains what's going on. He said to her, "If you weave the 7 braids of my hair with a web and fasten it to the wall with a pin, I'll grow weak and become like any man." So she put him to sleep, and she wove the 7 braids of his hair with a web and fastened it with a pin. So something has been skipped over in the Masoretic. Sometimes letters can get confused. So, for example, here in Ecclesiastes, the Masoretic text has, "Yes, all his days he eats in darkness," whereas the Septuagint has, "Yes, all his days are in darkness and gloom." Probably the scribe in the Masoretic text has misread the verb eats for the verb to be. Sometimes transposition of letters can occur when a scribe is writing things down. So in Deuteronomy, "And Moses went and spoke these words." And in the Qumran scroll, "And Moses finished speaking these words." Okay, so that reflects 2 different Hebrew roots where the letters have been switched. Sometimes there can be a bad division of verses that the scribe just doesn't understand when they're copying. So the Masoretic text here has, "For the day of Yahweh is coming, for it is near, a day of darkness and gloom." And the Syriac has divided the verse differently. "For the day of Yahweh is coming, for a day of darkness and gloom is near." And the Masoretic to be reflecting a parallelism between coming and is near, referring to the day of Yahweh, where the Syriac uses the near to express the sense of darkness and gloom. There can also be a misunderstanding of what vowels should be read. So here, the Masoretic text in Isaiah 7:11, "Whether it is deep, ask, or as high as the sky." And in the versions, "Whether it is as deep as Sheol or as high as the sky." The second seems to be the better reading. Somehow the verb to ask, sha'al, has been, misvocalized where it should be Sheol, but the scribe wrote sha'al to ask. Occasionally one finds a deliberate change which reflects a different tradition. So, for example, in Deuteronomy 27, 4b, the Masoretic text reflects Jewish tradition in which the stones are set up on Mount Ebal, whereas the Samaritan tradition, remember in the New Testament, there's this sort of disagreement between the Jews and the Samaritans. For the Samaritans, their holy mountain is Mount Gerizim, and so their text of Deuteronomy 27:4b talks about setting up stones on Mount Gerizim. Now, this is a bit controversial because not everybody accepts this fragment you see at the bottom as genuine, but there is a Dead Sea Scrolls, perhaps a Dead Sea Scrolls fragment that attests to the reading Mount Gerizim, which would follow the Samaritan. Okay, so what are some characteristics of ancient manuscripts to keep in mind? First of all, in ancient Hebrew texts, there were spaces between words and some indication of sections. You can see here there are little spaces between words, here, 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 here. And here's kind of like a section break because you see a blank line. In the oldest Greek text, there are no spaces between words, but you do have an indication of sections and paragraphs. In medieval Hebrew texts, those that are pointed, there are indications of verse and section divisions, but no chapter or verse numbering, except for the Psalms, where the individual Psalms are numbered. They aren't always numbered in a way that exactly agrees with our current Bibles. For example, the Leningrad Codex numbers the Psalms as 149 of them. It includes all the Psalms, it just numbers them differently. The chapter numbering used in Bibles today was developed by Archbishop Stephen Langton, or perhaps Cardinal Hugo de Santocare, in the 13th century. And it is unclear who should be credited with the first numbering of verses, but the first complete Vulgate Bible with verse numbering was published by Robert Etienne in the 16th century. The first English Bible with chapter and verse numbering was the Geneva Bible in 1560.